Hello, and welcome to Biblical Expedition. There are many challenges that face the church today. Some of these challenges are external, some of these challenges are internal. I think one of the greatest internal challenges that faces the church is that of generational differences. Before the 1800s, the average life expectancy was somewhere between 30 and 40 years old. During the 1800s up to the early 1900s, they'd only moved up a little bit to 40 and 45-year-olds. Now, during this time, there pretty much was only three generations that lived at one time. You were a child, you were a young adult, or you were an older individual. And pretty much the existence of these three generations was all consistent. They all had very similar experiences. They had very similar values. There wasn't much of a difference between someone who was 18, someone who was 25, or someone who was 40 years old. They had a very similar view of the world. Today, however, life expectancy is upwards of 80 or 90 years old, and what that has produced is a difference in how people view the world depending on when they grew up. Because we can find some very sharp distinctions between the different age groups that we have that live right now. And it's estimated that there are upwards of 7 different generations living simultaneously in the United States. Now, these differences that we have can range from different worldviews to different styles of music that we like, different social values we embrace, even different lifestyle choices. But if we're going to be the body of Christ, we need to learn to work together. We need to thrive on our differences rather than being separated on those. You probably have experienced this. Any given church that has multiple generations in it, from the old to the young, you'll find out that there's usually some differences in how they want to do the ministry, how they want to worship. All sorts of areas are affected by these different attitudes that we have depending on when we grew up. So what I want to do is I want to give just a general introduction here to the 7 different generations that we live with in the United States today. Now, the first of these generations is called the greatest generation. These are the individuals born between 1901 and 1924. This is the generation that lived through the Great Depression. Most of these individuals grew up without the modern conveniences that we just simply take for granted today. Things such as refrigerators, air conditioning, maybe even cars and things of that nature. This is a group that remembers life without electricity, without airplanes, without TV, even without radio. Their life was very, very different than ours. These are the individuals that today would be somewhere around 95 years and older. If you can find one, I would encourage you to talk with them, because you will hear some amazing stories about what life was like for them when they were a child or whenever they were a young adult. Some of the things they've seen come into existence has been so dramatic because we've had so much change since the time they were born to what we live like today. Now, the second generation is the builders. The builders are kind of the children of the greatest generation. These are the individuals born between 1925 and around 1945, and these dates can give or take a couple years. This is also called the silent or the industrial generation. These are the ones that were, at least the early part of this generation, were born and lived through World War II. They were responsible for the rebuilding of America after the war. Some of the key individuals that mark their generation are Frank Sinatra, Mickey Mouse. We saw the development of Mickey Mouse and all the things that came with Disney World, and even such great films as Gone with the Wind. That was part of their culture. During this time of the builders, they grew up with moms who pretty much stayed at home, and men would go out and they would work. And they would work not at multiple jobs, but they would typically find one job and they would stay at that job their entire lives until they retired, which is a lot different from what we find today in our society with the younger generations. Commonly understood during this time that children were to be seen and not heard. And again, that's very different from what you find in younger generations today. The adults of this generation would focus more on their careers, and they had less to do with social concerns, social issues, activism. Now, that's very unlike what their children were, and that is the third generation, and that is the baby boomers, or what has been shortened to simply the boomers. The baby boomers were born between 1946 and 1964, kind of beginning right there at the close of World War II. In fact, they were the result of soldiers coming home from World War II. Their generation, later on, as they got into their teen years and early 20s, were characterized by free love, drugs, and rock and roll. This is the Woodstock generation. This is the 60s and the 70s as they're coming into their own. They were known for protesting the wars that came about. In the 1950s, of the Korean War and the Vietnam War in the 60s, they were very much protesters of what was going on because, unlike their parents, they had lots of social concerns and they were very active in what they believed. Some of the key figures of this group were Bill Clinton, or still are, Bill Clinton, the Beatles, and Elvis. Those were some of the major personalities. And this was the first generation, the baby boomers, to have a two-income household, which led them to be able to buy some of the other things, such like TVs and those things that were coming into mainstream media, and also caused them to be the first TV generation. TV became a focal part of the family unit. They view technology not as something that's just a part of life, but something that is a learning process. Because a lot of all the inventions that we enjoy today kind of existed, or they saw the existence of these things coming about as they were living through their teens, into their 20s, and into their 30s. So technology was not always part of their life. It was something they had to learn, something they had to adopt and integrate. The next generation was the busters, and that is these are the ones who were born between 1965 and around 1976. This is also known as the Gen X, or the information generation, because with the advancement of technology, information was beginning to be spread more and more. TV was being used more and more. This generation grew up with Bugs Bunny, Gilligan's Island, MTV, and they saw the advent of cable TV. They experienced the emergence of heavy metal music, punk, grunge, hip-hop music, and all the stuff that we find from the 80s, some of the great bands during that time. Now, most of the people, a part of the busters, remember part of their school years, whether elementary or middle school, as a time when computers did not exist, and they kind of came into the education system or later as they reached into their 9th through 12th grade years. This is the group that is considered to be the ones who want what they want, and they want it now. That may also be why this is a generation that's deeply in debt, because they just, on credit, went out and got whatever they wanted. They didn't want to wait. They've also become known today as the sandwich generation, because they are taking care of their elderly parents, who are the boomers and the builders, but they're also having to take care of their children, who are the millennials. And this has become a stress for many within this generation. How do they balance the parents taking care of them in their old age and the kids who have gone off but now have come back and are still in their 20s? So they are sandwiched between those two issues. Now this leads us to the millennials. Millennials are those born in 1977 to 1995, a rather broad period of time. And they're known also as the digital generation, because digital type things, digital technology was really kind of part of society, and it was a normal part of society as they were growing up, especially those who were born toward the end of this generation around 1995. They're also called the Peter Pan generation, as I said, because many people see them as a group that just refused to grow up. They would go out, they would come back. And we had an idea introduced such as the gap year, that between high school and going to work, or between college and going to work, there is that gap year of trying to find themselves. This is a reality that earlier generations did not have, and they do not understand it very well. But as you think about the millennials are the people who were kind of the Google and the Facebook, the iPhone generation. They saw these things come into existence. Millennials expect access to information. They expect and they envision the world kind of as a 24/7 place. Now, that kind of brings us to Generation Z. Generation Z is the kids of the earlier millennials. They could also be some of the children of the Generation X that were before them. But this is the group of people born between 1996 and 2009. This particular group spans elementary kids today to those who are kind of in their mid-20s. They've never known a world without computers. Computers have always been a part. They didn't see the advent or the coming about of computers into mainstream, the marketplace. And they've never known a world without cell phones. They have integrated technology seamlessly into their life. It's just a part of everyday living. This group also, very much like the millennials, are very globally focused, they're visually engaged, and they are defined by their social relationships. This is a group that will see the advent of Google Glass, quantum computing, and driverless cars if all things go correct. Now that brings us to the last generation. This is the Generation Alpha. I'm kind of starting over with the Greek alphabet now, and this is the generation known as the I generation, or the iPad generation. They began to be born in 2010 with the release of the iPad. This is a generation that has been entirely born in the 21st century, and they too are very globally focused in their worldview, at least those who are on the first end of this. They're inheriting that from their parents, those who are part of the Generation Z. Now, this particular group began, as I said, with the release of the iPad in 2010. They will grow up with devices that are not only digital, but very possibly with devices that are AI-oriented, artificial intelligence. So things such as Google Home, Alexa, Siri, interactive TVs, and interactive game systems. These are just part of life. My generation saw when Google Home and Alexa came into being, or use of Siri on the handheld technology. But this generation has just always known it. It's just always been a reality for them. And because of that, it's believed that this is a generation that will trust artificial intelligence very possibly more than other relationships. Much of their health diagnostics and health concerns will be addressed by AI, artificial intelligence, rather than by some physical physician. The neural networking of taking the brain and kind of connecting that to some artificial intelligence is a real possibility for them to experience in their lifetime. In fact, this generation has the possibility of seeing the application of quantum computing unlike any other generation before it. And that mixed with AI technology can bring about some rather spectacular changes in our future, just in how we live daily lives. What's interesting is that this generation, the Generation Alpha, will see probably technology more as a utopian rather than a dystopian dream. They will see technology as the promise of a better tomorrow, whereas those who are part of the builders and the millennials, especially the greatest generation, the first generation, they would tend to see it more as a dystopian. The younger generations are saying, hey, it's more like Star Trek, if you think of it in that way. It's more like Star Trek that says everything is better because of technology, whereas when you get to the older generations, even down to the Generation X, my generation, we have that distrust in a sense of technology. We're involved in it, but we still have seen the Terminator, and we know that for the Terminator, things didn't work out very well. So, we see artificial intelligence more like Skynet that comes back to kill mankind rather than to help mankind. So there's more of a skepticism of technology the earlier you go or the older you go in your generation versus the younger generation that sees technology as just a daily thing that's going to be there to help them. Now, what does all this mean? I mean, these generations are very important because, as I said, there's differences in how we view. If you think back to the 80s and the 90s, there was the worship wars. Worship wars were about how do we correctly worship God? Do we use drums and guitars? Do we use a band? Or do we use a choir and do we sing hymns? And you probably have heard about the wars that are going on. In fact, there's still churches today that are going through some of these things, where churches are saying we want a choir, we want one director. Others are saying, no, we want a praise band, we want a praise team. And a lot of churches during the 80s and 90s divided and separated over these particular issues because they had generational differences in how they saw worship and music integrating with the Christian faith. So today, as the church, if we're going to thrive, we must learn to work together. We must learn to understand these differences between our different generations and be able to bridge some kind of gap despite those different perspectives. Now, if we work together, I think what we'll start to see is that, especially if we understand each other, we'll start to see that our differences can actually be some of our strengths. We can learn from one another. We can grow from one another. So the next time you're engaging with someone who is of a different age, and you start seeing that they're looking at life much different than you, think about these 7 different generations. Find out where they are, and that will give you more of a perspective to say, I understand now why you see what you see. But if we're going to be effective, if we're going to thrive, as I said, as the church, we have to learn to overcome these differences. We have to learn to appreciate what all of us have experienced. And I think that's one of the biggest things. As we look back to an older generation, one of the things that we can learn is, how was God faithful to you during those times? We can learn from each other's faith, each other's wisdom, each other's experience. So I pray that we will be able to be effective as a church and be multi-generational as we build upon our strengths rather than taking away. Until next time, may God bless you.